Pre-scroll credit sequences are some of the most prevalent mainstream examples of experimental animated film, and nobody believes me. Because A, hardly anyone stays for the credits of films anymore, and B, because mainstream audiences who are taking their kids to go see the Lego Movie 2 don't have a good understanding of what even makes a film experimental, other than that they're often confusing, because they are. Part of what makes experimental films so confusing is a general lack of narrative form in favor of a more interpretive one. They don't tell a story so much as convey abstract ideas through the medium of light dancing across celluloid. Or digital pixels, since let's face it, this is 2021, hardly anything is 100% analog anymore. But there are more precise ways to define an experimental film, and I say precise, but perhaps what I mean is involved. In his essay Notes Towards a Theory of Animation from his book Understanding Animation, Paul Wells breaks down the dichotomy between orthodox and experimental film. He gives us 7 different factors, each on a sliding scale, to consider when trying to place any given piece of media on a spectrum of animation. They are configuration versus abstraction, specific continuity versus non-specific continuity, narrative form versus interpretive form, evolution of content versus evolution of materiality, unity of style versus multiple styles, absence of artist versus the presence of an artist, and dynamics of dialogue versus the dynamics of musicality. If more of your sliders weigh heavy on the right side, you have a pretty good argument that your given piece of media is experimental. And that's what I'm gonna do with the animated credit sequence to the Lego Movie 2, the second part. And after that, we'll get into some closer analysis as to whether or not it uses film language to potentially critique the children's media industry as a whole. But you're gonna have to sit through the boring experimental stuff first. Speaking of wading through boring stuff, let's talk about the history of credit sequences and how they're descendants of title sequences. In the olden days of film, title sequences typically played before the main runtime. They included marquee names for big actors and director credits and studio production logos. Not in that order. Taking note from the long tradition of overtures that played before many theatrical stage productions, films began using these title sequences to set the mood for the following show. Live-action films could open with animated title sequences, and nowadays close with them. And even animated films might change art style for these sequences. In the 1950s, a particular style of title sequence rose into popularity due to the work of graphic artists like the legendary Saul Bass. Bass in particular was known for his kinetic typography. You may know this style from the work that he'd done with director Alfred Hitchcock on films like North by Northwest, Vertigo, and Psycho. Kinetic typography, or letters that move, was a style that really emphasized language, musicality, and animation. In a preface to an interview she conducted with Saul Bass, writer Pamela Haskin notes that one marked characteristic of the Bass title is that its images undergo a journey whereby they are transformed into the unexpected. Letters and shapes weave together to set the mood for the following picture, and usually they only tell a story that's tangentially related to the following film plot. In that same interview, Bass is quoted as saying, "My initial thoughts about what a title could do was to set mood and to prime the underlying core of the film's story, to express the story in some metaphorical way." Title sequences are more experimental than traditional narrative film. They are more metaphorical, they have a greater interaction with their own musicality, they are more abstract. And these same traits from opening title sequences carried over when films began putting them after the main runtime, but before the black back scroll, which itself was gradually moved to the end of films in the 60s and 70s as unions began breaking up the Hollywood studio bubble. But that's a story for another day. My point here is that animated credit sequences are made with similar principles as the old Bassian title sequences. And the Lego Movie 2 has one such credit sequence. So let's break down this sequence according to the axioms provided by Wells, starting with the difference between configuration and abstraction. If you've seen the Lego Movie or its sequel, you'll notice that the figures we see in the credits sequence are representative of the ones in the film, but are technically off-model. are more pixelated or blocky, rougher, not expressive. They are still animated to look like Legos, but these are sculptures made from Lego bricks rather than the figures that we've grown accustomed to seeing. They are icons of the characters in the movie we just watched. They are abstractions of a more orthodox character model. So check 1 in the experimental column. In terms of continuity, we have a bit more of a mixed bag here. Sure, we have specific continuity when it comes to which characters are being shown on screen. We have no new faces. And since we're getting a thematic recap, all of the scenes recreated in Tableau exist within the context of the main film's plot. On the other hand, there is no cohesive plotline connecting these dioramas. Each one seems to exist almost independently of the others. There is no reason that the scene of Emmett and Wildstyle making an abhorrent amount of toast appears before them sitting on a double-decker couch with Unikitty. We see characters mowing lawns, scenes that take place in both night and day. At one point there's a rocket-powered school bus. We have no context for why these images are seemingly related. Similarly, there is no connective narrative between the scenes. There are visual references to both the Lego Movie and the Lego Movie 2, but this sequence itself has no definitive narrative. In the words of Saul Bass, it sets the tone and mood for the story, but only tells the same story in a metaphorical way. Even in the article we're using to define these terms, Wells suggests that narrative films are held in place by specific continuity. Both terms are related, and this sequence leans more towards experimental on either slider. Now, let me read you Wells' description of the difference between the evolution of content and the evolution of materiality. The orthodox cartoon only occasionally draws the audience's attention to its construction, and thus the invisibility of its aesthetic achievement and its industrial content. Whereas this sequence pulls back the imaginary curtain, speaking metaphorically of course, to reveal the gears at work behind the scenes. Please remember that our main character is a construction worker, and most of the main cast are master builders who can reshape the world around them. This clip is not live action. It is fully computer animated like the rest of the film, and yet this credit sequence suggests that perhaps the motions and transitions are machinations of practical effects. We are so clearly meant to glimpse into the industrial nature here. Our eyes are drawn to the motorized gears and chains that keep everything running. There is no illusion of immersion here. We are invited to see these sculptures as staged, as animation itself. So yeah, a big old check mark here. The same goes for being invited to see the hand of the author. For one thing, the industrial framing device is indicative of the human hands that built it, as opposed to the in-universe characters. But even more obviously, this is a credit sequence.
It's the credits! Yeah, that's the best part! When the movie ends and the reading starts!
The names of the creators are being paraded forth for us to recognize and appreciate. The presence of an author could not be clearer.
And we're back, and still loving the credits. Can't wait to see the one about the person who edits. And even better than that is who edits the credits. I bet I'll never forget it, because once I read it, then I read it.
Of course, this credit sequence is extraordinarily orthodox when it comes to unity of style. While this animation style, the hyper-realistic, non-expressive industrial look, is unique to this sequence and not the main film itself, the style remains consistent throughout this sequence. There are no transitions to anything other than this series of linking tableaus. But the final category laid out by Wells is one of the most interesting, the dynamics of dialogue versus musicality. First of all, there is no dialogue in this sequence, but there is a constant fourth wall breaking narration playing through the music underneath it.
And we're still in the song. How long are these credits? Because they seem long.
Frankly, I would be remiss not to mention the omnipotent verses that explicitly reference the fact that this is a credit sequence. We have lyrics about how great credits are, how voice actors are glorified over other artists.
Without the human element, it's just zeros and ones. That's why when we pay them the money, we pay them tons.
And ones that include the names of the film's stereoscopic supervisor and associate producer.
I can't believe they got Chris Connington to be the stereoscopic supervisor.
This is not Mickey Mousing in the traditional sense. There is no motion synchronized to the backing track. But there is an interplay between the text, the animation, and the spoken word underneath that isn't typically present in orthodox animation. There's even a verse where the narration reaches out to the audience and asks that they stay in their seats for the credits.
The credits of the film are the main attraction. And don't even think about trying to leave, or you might miss a name, like Pam and Steve. Both incredible names, so let's stay in our seats and read a credible list of their incredible feats.
Presumably because they know that most theater audiences would have already started packing up their coats. And now that we've covered all the reasons that this is indeed an example of mainstream experimental film, we can discuss what it all means. And speaking of fourth wall breaking tendencies, let's talk a bit more about space and how this sequence uses it to further abstract itself away from the main franchise. In another essay on animation, because yes, we do read a ton of these, Aylish explains that the concept of reverberation enables a shift from the conventional view of space as a place where actions occur to seeing space as something that visibly reforms. What does that word salad mean? Basically, this essay was about how certain, often experimental, animated media reanimates space in a way that is just not possible for live-action film. It does this so often through a technique called metamorphosis, or the transitions between beats and images, which pretty much encapsulates what we see in the LEGO Movie 2's credits. Each tableau transforms into the next on a rotating mechanical device. They are literally reforming into each other, which is a distinct process separate from the rest of the franchise because of a style choice that de-emphasizes the importance of individual characters. Also in that Woods essay, she writes that the importance of a feature and an image is whether or not a character can act, and in doing so give meaning to space. None of these articulations, however, approach space when it exists on the screen as an event in itself, where the actions of characters are set aside rather than the other way around. In the LEGO Movie 2, space still shifts and gets rebuilt, but it is by the characters interacting with their surroundings. But in this credit sequence, the space itself is what is controlling what our characters' stand-ins are seen doing. They act more like non-sentient puppets than anywhere else in this franchise about literal Legos who are acting as a child's plaything. Space is critical. It has its own sense of agency here that makes us aware that we are watching an intricately made but ultimately artificial animated film. So besides reminding us that we're in a theater or streaming from our phones at a bus stop, what is this sequence trying to say? Why draw our attention to the fact that our experience for the last 2 hours has all just been an elaborate sham? Let's turn again to the lyrics of the song, just not the pseudo-rap parts.
Unbelievable, super cool, outrageous, and amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible. Woo-hoo!
Unbelievable, super cool, outrageous, and amazing. Phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible. Woohoo! What are these adjectives? Positive buzzwords? Yeah, but you could also say that they're common generic inserts for children's media reviews. Here are a few critic reviews for the first LEGO Movie on Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. Terrific, fantastic, spectacular, awesomeness, marvelous, outrageous, amazing, phenomenal. They're all words that carry the same surface level praise. They're not really critiques. They're hardly reviews. They mean practically nothing. So on top we have this industrial looking mass-produced visual that exposes the manufactured nature of modern animated children's media. And underneath we have a chorus of empty praise, highlighting the meaninglessness of media criticism. I don't want to rehash examples, but we can also take another look at the verse describing the actors themselves, who get the longest and most focused portion of the credit sequence dedicated to their names.
Time for the actors, the ones who elicit all the joy and the laughter. In the voiceover studio, slaving away. They had to work almost 4 whole hours a day. It's a nightmare. There's so much strain on the brain, and their only compensation is the money and fame. Without the human element, it's just zeros and ones. That's why when we pay them the money, we pay them tons.
They almost had to work 4 whole hours a day, and their only compensation is the money and fame? I think it's significant here that the soundtrack doesn't give any context as to who acted in the film, but does draw specific attention to the names of crew members who would have otherwise never gotten the same audience recognition for their work on the same project.
Timothy Smith is my favorite producer.
But do keep in mind that despite all of this, the sequence is still animated in bright colors and the music is upbeat, relentlessly positive. So, if you are the kind of person who walks out of a theater or clicks on another tab when the main runtime of the movie is over, you would have never noticed the hidden message underneath the more orthodox, sanitized, and polished animation. The interview I quoted earlier also gives us another insight into Saul Bass's philosophy behind title sequence animation. We love doing titles. We do them in a nice, obsessive way. We futz with them until we're happy and do things nobody else will notice but us. We like the notion of the bottom of the table being finished even though nobody sees it. Movie credit sequences are an art nobody notices, not because they aren't mainstream. Almost every film includes one, but because they are the bottom of the table. A piece included for its necessity, but ultimately not the reason that you bought a ticket in the first place.
I go to the theater about 90 minutes late. Skip the whole dang movie because the credits are great. Now if you're gonna be featured on a movie song, the credits is the part that you wanna be on. Yeah, I like to watch the credits.
Super cool! Ooh, the bibliography is included in the description of the video below. Whoa!